Chapter 7 End of Heresy. Far to the galactic north, the fires of the Horus heresy raged on. The traitor legions had never admitted defeat and continued their campaign to dominate humanity. They were opposed by the remnants of the loyalist legions, battered and bloodied, but still burning with the need for vengeance. The Sons of Horus fought a steadfast rearguard, the loss of their father doing nothing to diminish their skills in war. Their feints and counterattacks were swift and hard, going straight for the throat as had ever been their way. They were chased by the Blood Angels, whose reaction to their own father's death could not have been more different. With incandescent wrath, they hurled themselves at the offspring of their father's murderer. Blood demanded blood, and they ignored their own wounds to close with the hated foe and unleashed their blackest rage. The Blood Angels fought a bleak campaign across the circumference of the Eye of Terror, crushing and burning all opposition, uncaring for how many innocents were caught in the crossfire. The unexplained loss of their homeworld Caliban and enigmatic disappearance of their Primarch seemed to have unleashed a terrible ire. They fought with the zeal and fervour of those who had seen their hearths and homes burnt before their eyes, but all inquiries into the matter were met with flinty stares and bitter silence. The Death Guard continued their rampage, filling worlds with disease and rot for the delight of Grandfather Nurgle. The White Scars were in hot pursuit. Once they had been the hunted, but no more. Never again would they let anyone else determine their destiny. At their head was Jagatai Khan, whom had a blood debt to settle. He did not know if Mortarion could bleed any more, but he was determined to find out. The Iron Hands fell upon heretics and traitors with icy vehemence, seeking to drown the pain of their Primarch's loss in blood. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The Emperor's children led a merry dance across the stars, pleasing Slaanesh with the horrors they inflicted on the helpless and pure of heart. They were hounded by the Salamanders, who scoured away their perversion with the purity of fire. Though few, indeed Vulcan was with them for every battle. What his sons could not scorch clean, he would smash with his irresistible strength. The Iron Warriors moved to secure the worlds around Olympia, bitterly digging in and determined to make any intruders pay for every step they took. But ever the more furious and unyielding was the Imperial Fists, advancing in golden waves and tearing down every barrier and obstacle held against them. The Word-Bearers followed Erebus and Cor Ferron in a swathe of conquests, casting down the symbols of imperial rule and setting up cathedrals to the glory of chaos. Lorgar himself, though retreated into bitter seclusion, his every sacrifice and betrayal had been driven by his belief in the inevitability of victory. He had set divinity against the atheism of his father and lost. But what truly broke his spirit was that the ruinous powers didn't seem to care. In fact, they only laughed at his torment. The World Eaters were leaderless and without direction, heeding only the howls of Khorne to butcher and maim. They were beset on every side by the Raven Guard, who through a series of ambushes and daring strikes exacted a terrible revenge for the infamous 98 days in Istevan V. The Thousand Sons meandered between library worlds and research outposts, looting all they found. Magnus had foreseen this conflict would last millennia, and he had preparations to make. They left in their wake cults of Tzeentch, who multiplied like a virus, laying the foundations of a corruption that would plague the Imperium forevermore. When Leman Russ heard of this, his rage was staggering to behold. He ordered his Space Wolves, 13th Company, to harry the foe and deny them respite. They swore to follow the traitors into whatever hell they cowered and not return until they had the heads of each Magnus Sorcerer Lord in their hands. The Night Lords laughed to see their kin butcher themselves on the altar of vengeance. They cared about nothing but their own self-aggrandizement. Leaving their cousins to their bloodshed, Kurz led them into the galactic east, to his fortress of bones. He had an appointment with destiny, and he did not intend to miss it. Reports of the Alpha Legion were few and far between, and they seemed to be taking little part in the fighting. The few sightings revealed them to be scouring random worlds linked only by a series of ancient Xeno-halting sites. A single patrol ship reported sighting their fleet assaulting an unknown vessel that resembled a massive bronze disc. Regrettably, in the Carnage of War, this was just one more mystery that would never be explained. This war was as terrible and destructive as the worst that the arch-betrayer Horus had unleashed. Though the high and mighty of the Imperium would prefer to deny it, had the loyalist legions not continued the fight, the Imperium would certainly have fallen. The situation was finely balanced. The irresistible force met the immovable object, and there was no telling which side would win. Then came the Imperial Cult. With faith and fury, the cultists hurled themselves at the traitor legion, seeking vengeance for their crimes against the God Emperor. Even the Chaos Marines struggled to hold against the tidal wave of zealotry unleashed against them, the masses seeking to bury them in bodies. No matter what horrors they unleashed, the cultists just became ever more fanatical, wave upon wave of them as endless as the ocean. The cult had more bodies than they had bolt shells. Eventually, the traitors had no choice but to retreat into the Eye of Terror and brood bitterly on the fate they had chosen for themselves. For this part, the traitor Primarch Rogal was stunned. This new faith was everything he'd ever dreamed of creating. The power of belief was truly unleashed, yet he found himself on the wrong end of their jihad. For the first time, he understood his betrayed father's warnings about the perils of setting up gods to serve one's own ends. Twice he had placed his faith in divinity, and twice it had proven too weak to accomplish his goals. Filled with bitterness and resentment, he resolved to spite his new deities and take his own life. But the gods of chaos are cruel and capricious. They owned him now, body and soul, and were loath to relinquish their new plaything. Even as his blades found purchase in his hearts, they poured their power into his mind and body, cursing him with immortality. Filled with the potency of the warp, the new demon prince screamed his despair. He was now doomed to spend eternity watching the two faiths he had birthed wage endless war upon each other. With the laughter of the ruinous powers booming in his ears, Rogal retreated to the Sicarius and sealed himself into a towering basilica to brood on his god's endless failures. Chapter 8. The New Order. The heartlands of the Imperium had been secured, and a brief respite bought time to weigh the costs of war. The tragedy was immense. No census could even begin to count the number of dead, and not one world had escaped the carnage. Determined to rebuild what had been lost, Roboute Guilliman returned to Terra and was hailed as a conquering hero. The masses greeted him with jubilation and worship, riotous celebrations sweeping across the globe as their hero returned, and the high and mighty of the Imperium bowed before him. The avenging son was offered the joint offices of both Imperial Regent and War Master, and massive protests broke out in every hive, calling for him to become the absolute master of mankind. To his credit, Roboute Guilliman refused any such honour. He addressed the masses and declared, "Too much power has been granted to too few men. Power corrupts, and no man, not even a Primarch, can be entrusted with such dread authority ever again." Guilliman was true to his word and summoned a great council to Terra, formed from the greatest mortal generals and richest princes and manufacturers. He included the heads of every imperial institution. They were the first High Lords of Terra, and Guilliman took his place amongst them as an equal. The need for reform was unanimously recognized. It was not enough to replace heads of institutions. The Imperium needed a complete restructuring from the ground up. The new High Lords approved and endorsed Guilliman's policy of decentralizing power, splitting the Imperium into 5 segmentums: Solar, Tempestus, Obscurus, Pacificus, and Ultima. Furthermore, they split the army into 2, the Imperial Guard and the Navy, so no traitorous armies could move between worlds and no admiral could conquer worlds alone. Every imperial institution had its role redefined, and merchant princes and rogue traders were forced to comply with imperial regulations to better curtail their independence. Critical to this policy was the raising up of a new imperial inquisition to positions of unquestionable authority and influence. Even the most vaunted positions of power could not avoid their penetrating gaze. Yet the most shocking and controversial decree of all was the High Lord's boldest proposal. The Loyalist legions were to be disbanded. A new Adeptus Astartes was to be created, formed out of the old legions. These new forces were to be organized into independent chapters. Henceforth, no single commander could lead more than 1,000 Space Marines in battle. This finally proved to be too controversial a demand for the other Primarchs to tolerate. Even they could not ignore this insult. Thus, they were finally forced to break off their headlong pursuit of their kin. The Primarchs had been obsessed with hunting down and punishing the traitors and had been oblivious to the changing times behind their lines. The people of Terra had seen Space Marines bring fire and ruin down upon them, and billions had died in the siege. Unlike the Ultramarines, the other legions had been absent from the heartlands of the Imperium, fighting distant battles, unsung and unacknowledged. To the common folk, there was little difference between the Loyalists and the traitor Marines. First to arrive was Leman Russ, the barbaric lord of winter and war. The heaving masses greeted him with jeers and scorn, but then he was used to that. Next was Jagatai Khan, who took the derision in his stride, ever uncaring for what others thought of him. Corvus Corax, however, was disturbed by the reaction. If humanity no longer trusted the Astartes, then were the halls of power really their place anymore? However, Vulcan was deeply wounded by the crowd's taunts. No other Primarch had such a deep connection to the common folk. The gulf of separation between themselves and the mass of normal people was growing into an unbridgeable chasm. If the lords of the Imperium could no longer identify with the people they ruled over, then what did that mean for the future of this empire, pondered the Lord of Drakes. One by one the Primarchs met the new High Lords in the Senatorium Imperalis and heard their case. Corax and Jagatai were most impressed by Guilliman's arguments and his tactical philosophies, but disquieted by the idea of splitting their legions. They argued instead that new legions should be formed from scratch to replace those who had turned from the light. Vulcan said, while he admired the spirit of the Codex Astartes, with his legions so grievously reduced, he could not endorse it. Leman Russ's response was deafening and coarse. Several of the Senate's minor lords had to be taken away and sedated when he issued his rebuttal. Without the support of the Primarchs, the High Lords could not reach a consensus, and it seemed the issue would never reach a conclusion. Then a new player entered the stage. Around Pluto, space buckled and tore as something truly massive forced its way into real space. A veritable forest of gilded spires and flying buttresses heralded the arrival of a craft the size of a small moon. It was a euphoric vision of gold and steel, every inch both beautiful and deadly. With a foredeck that alone could dock 12 cruisers, it was the Phalanx. At its helm was Rogal Dorn. The Praetorian of Terra had returned home, and he was determined to put a stop to the High Lord's foolishness. Chapter 9. Brothers Debate. The chamber was wide and echoing, filled only with a massive table that was gargantuan in proportions. Around the table were 21 chairs, 1 a massive gilded throne, 2 were blank, 9 defaced, but 9 more were pristine and emblazoned with proud symbols. Seated around the table were a group of figures. The chamber may be massive, but it still could barely contain the presence of the beings within. The sons of the Emperor were singular creations. The meeting of even 2 of them was a significant moment. 3 of them meeting would have been a moment to be commemorated for future generations, but here were no less than 5 Primarchs convening. Corax was a shadow made flesh in his dark armour. Even sitting in the light was somehow distant and obscured. Once the brothers would have met in simpler robes, but in these times they had learned the hard way to never let their guard down. The Raven Lord looked around the chamber and remarked, You know, Rabute has an almost identical chamber to this on Macragge. It's amazing how similar you two are in certain ways. Regal Dorn was a golden giant, stoic and implacable. One could be forgiven for thinking him a legend raised straight out of the ancient myths. Only those who knew him well would have seen the twitch of an eyebrow at the comment hinting at the simmering anger he held under tight control. Gilliman's recklessness is why I requested we meet here on the Phalanx, he growled. While we were fighting to save the Imperium, the eagle in the east launched his own bid for power. But we shall not bow to this tyranny. Vulcan leaned forward from his place next to Corax, his massive plate a masterwork of beauty and functionality. Between the drake bones festooning his plate, charcoal skin and burning eyes. He could have been mistaken for a devil from countless dead religions, but nothing could have been further from the truth. His voice was a deep rumble as he declared, "Rabute is many things, but he is no tyrant. If he does anything, you can be assured he has calculated to the 10th decimal place that it is the proper course of action." "Nevertheless, he has embarked upon a path of madness," snarled Dorn. "Breaking up the legions, scattering our forces to the 9 vectors, setting up petty clerks to rule." Leman Russ leant forward, his fangs glinting from his jaws. His armour proudly displaying the scars and craters of fierce battle. He wore the fetishes and totems of a primitive warlord, but the glint in his eyes belied a deep cunning and self-awareness that few would credit him with. He barked. "Gilliman has a mind like an abacus. He to be stopped on this, at least we are all agreed." "Are we?" said Corax, looking across the table where Jagatai Khan was sat. A place had been laid out for the Warhawk in the 5th seat, next to Leman Russ, but he had deliberately sat on the far side in one of the defaced chairs. Whether it was a subtle refusal to be defined by others, or he simply didn't care, was impossible to say. His plate was austere compared to his kin, even minimalist. But it was masterfully wrought and lost nothing for it. In fact, so regally did he wear it, he made everyone else look garish in comparison. The brothers waited for the master of the horde to indicate his position, but the Khan of Khans said nothing. "The debating chamber is Gilliman's arena. I shall challenge him to single combat, and he shall feel the wrath of Fenris. Break his body, and we will break his will." Corax sighed. "Leman, your sons are not here. You do not have to play the barbarian around us. This is no time for your boasts and outlandish bluffs." Leman smiled around his fangs. "You know less than you think, young crow. I never bluff." Dorn banged his fist upon the table hard enough to create cracks in the granite. "Enough of this petty bickering," he barked. "We cannot afford to fight among ourselves anymore. We must be united in purpose and force, here and at war. Gilliman must be made to see that these ridiculous ideas will only lead to division and weakness." "Malcador may be gone, but his legacy lives on," sneered Russ. "Suspicion, paranoia, and obfuscation rule now. These men simply do not trust us." "Should they?" asked Korak pointedly. "What have we brought humanity except war? We cast down one set of tyrants and set ourselves up in their place." "You would trust these petty bureaucrats to lead?" snarled Russ. Corax's soft reply conveyed a world of sorrow. "They could hardly do worse than we did." Vulcan leaned forwards. "You do not know these men as I do. I have seen their hearts, and their metal is soft. They will play the humble servant while Rabute's eye is upon them, but as soon as his back is turned, they will begin to plot and scheme as the petty kings of old night once did. Mark my words, without a stalwart guard to ensure their quality, they will begin to bicker and stagnate. This whole Imperium will rot from the inside out. Then we must save them from themselves, declared Dorn. We must treat this debate as any other battlefield. Gather our allies and hit the foe where they are vulnerable. Leman Russ smiled. The Lion once told me some interesting things regarding what the Lord of Ultramar has been doing. If you insist on being subtle, then there is much we could do with the information of the Imperium Secundus. A sudden crash reverberated around the chamber. Jagatai Khan's open hand had slapped the table hard. No. Have we no secrets? If we walk road, then all shames dragged into light. All suffer. Need now harmony, not discord. Vulcan leaned forward, his mighty plates creaking. Don't tell us you agree with Rabute, he asked. Jagatai Khan shrugged, an impressive feat for a being in power armor. Winds change, he said. Wise men follow. Korak stood to his feet and leaned forwards, hands on the table. I agree with Jagatai, he stated bluntly. We always knew the day would come when we would have to step aside and let mankind find its own way. I admit I did not think it would happen this way, but the people have told us what they need. If we cannot listen, then we are no better than the tyrants we cast down. Rogal Dorn opened his arms wide in appeasement. Brothers, do not do this. Together there is yet hope of setting things right. Jagatai pushed to his feet and stood with Korax as the Raven Lord said, Hope is for the poets and dreamers. We choose and we act. Then they turned and left, leaving the 3 remaining brothers sitting dejectedly. There is now no other choice, said Rogal. We are committed to our course. Let us come with you, said Leman. We shall march into the Senate as comrades and show these counting clerks what it truly takes to lead an empire. No, replied Dorn. You have worked hard to build your reputation. Your presence would only confirm their worst fears about us. We must look elsewhere for support. Leman, speak to the Lord Militants. They, at least, still respect you. Vulcan, you must go to Mars. The patronage of the Mechanicum will be essential in this. I will go to the palace and confront Gilliman directly. I will force him to see sense. Leman's face fell at the thought of endless meetings with retired generals and gaggles of aides, but he nodded his agreement. They turned to Vulcan, who sat in silence for a moment, then reluctantly nodded. Then our course is set, said Dorn. This will end where it began, on Terra. Chapter 10. Council. The Senatorum was a grand amphitheatre, capable of seating thousands of dignitaries. The vast majority within were pale functionaries, whispering and shuffling as they made clandestine deals and traded favours. At the heart of the arena was a raised dais upon which sat a dozen high lords, each wearing a simple grey robe. They may have sought humility and equality, but their uniformity could not hope to hide the giant amongst them. He was a towering, gene-bulked transhuman. His grey robes trimmed with the blue of the Macrag's oceans, and the sweeping locks of his brow were blonde white. His simple presence filled the vast senatorium without him having to say anything, and he drew every eye like an iron to a magnet. Suddenly the senatorium was filled with commotion, and all debates ceased as all the guards ran to the great doors. But none of them made it, each and every one stopping in his tracks and standing there slack-jawed, weapons falling from limp fingers as a towering golden giant swept past them. With total disdain, Rogal Dorn marched past the guards into the Senatorum. He was a sculpted vision of perfection, his gold armour gleaming and dabbed with perfect tears of ash to mark his grief. His furious gaze swept across the assembled multitudes in the arena, but it was to the giant who rose to meet him that he spoke. "Guilliman," he said, voice simmering with a deeply suppressed rage. "So, it was here you hatched your plots and schemes. Was it here you betrayed your principles too? Was it here you abandoned everything we fought for?" Guilliman opened his mighty arms in a gesture of welcome. "Brother, the galaxy has changed," he said, trying to placate his enraged brother. "Our age is past. This is the Imperium of man, not the Empire of the Astartes. The time has come for the men to lead, mortal men who know humility and whose ambitions are not so perilous." Dorn's hands twitched fractionally towards the glorious engraved bolt pistol holstered at his thigh, but he stilled the motion with iron control. He marched forward till the two brothers were face to face as he declared, "Father entrusted us to build his vision. It is our duty to guard humanity. Only we have the strength to take back what was ours. Only we have the vision, what it once was." One of the grey-robed figures around the table sat forward and coughed to interrupt, saying, "Lord Dorn, if I may say that everybody here appreciates your efforts in these difficult times. But surely now is the time for rational thought and impartial." Dorn's stare could have melted plasteel, scorching his scorn and contempt into the High Lord's soul. He dwindled off into mortified silence, and those around him, without moving or saying anything, tried to imply they weren't stupid enough to interrupt again. "Rogal," said Rabute softly, trying to reach an understanding with his brother. "The past is the past, and we must look to the future." "Victory is within our grasp," cried Dorn, desperately trying to make his brother see the truth. "The traitors have been driven beyond Cadia, and I have fortified the gates to ensure they shall never return. We can start a new great crusade, restore terror and the glory of the Emperor's rule. Is that why you usurped us, Rabute? Because you cannot bear that our glories surpass yours?" Rabute's own ire was rising, and it was evident his temper was fraying in his reply. "Rogal, this is not about glory. It is about building an inheritance for mankind that would last a millennia. Nothing can endure if it is built upon flawed foundations. Had you remembered that, Praetorian of Terror, then perhaps the siege would have ended differently." "You dare!" Dorn roared, as he loomed forward, his anger at breaking point. "Where were you when the traitors beat upon the walls of this very palace? Where were you when we chased them across the stars? You hid amongst your precious 500 worlds!" Rogal's furious rant went on. "You stand in cowardice and dare to judge us. You knew the Emperor's vision for the future as well as any of us. Father would never have endorsed this folly." Guilliman crossed his mighty arms, standing firm against this tirade and saying gravely, "The Emperor we know is gone. We must serve the Emperor who is." "We can still put it back," cried Dorn, spreading his arms to take in the whole auditorium, trying to make them see his conviction. "We can put it all back to the way it was." Guilliman shook his patrician head and said, "It is too late, brother. The decision has been made. This is pure necessity. It is humanity's need that drives us to do this." "Need?" snarled Dorn. "What need drives you to act like a whipped dog? You let them shatter the legions. You let them pull your teeth. You would sell us into slavery? We were created to lead humanity into the stars, not lick its boots." Dorn raised his gaze to look across the Senatorum, and every lord and functionary felt his burning gaze upon them. "Not one of you here even knows how much blood, how many lives we have sacrificed to keep you safe in your ivory towers. All you quill pushers and counting clerks should prostrate before us in gratitude." Gilliman's next words would set in motion a catastrophic series of events. "You sound like Horus." Dorn's fist blurred. One instant he was at rest. The next he was an oncoming juggernaut of gold. The blow would have caved in a Space Marine's skull. It would have dented a rhino's hull. It actually knocked Gilliman back a step. The Lord of Ultramar stood there in shock, hand clasped on his bruised jaw, unable to believe the stoic Praetorian of Terror would act so. Dorn yelled, "You have no authority over my legion, and I will prove our worth in battle. There is one traitor who has yet to flee into the warp, abortion beyond Cadia. He squats in the Sebastus system, mocking our manifest victory." Dorn turned to address the whole audience. "I shall personally dig him out, and when I bring Perturabo back in an iron cage, you will see I am right and forget this foolishness." With these words, the Golden Primarch turned his back on the council and marched once more to war.